Imagine a restaurant's health inspection score, right?
Okay, yeah, like the
Yeah.
letter grade in the window.
Exactly. Now, imagine using that exact same grade to predict if the building itself is about to get struck by lightning.
I mean, that sounds completely absurd.
Right, it makes no sense. A badly managed kitchen might have, electrical issues or whatever, sure. But inspecting the plumbing tells you absolutely nothing about the massive supercell storm rolling in from the west.
No, of course not. It's totally disconnected.
Yet for years, the global financial system essentially used these macroeconomic checklists to predict civil war and state collapse.
Which is just wild.
It really is, and it left hundreds of millions of lives caught in these massive blind spots. So welcome to today's deep dive. It is Wednesday, June 10th, 2026, and we are getting into some heavy, incredibly important material today.
We really are. And just to set the stage on the scale of those blind spots, it is sobering. When you zoom out and look at the entire global landscape, roughly 1.25 billion people live in countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence.
1.25 billion. That's a staggering portion of the human population.
Exactly. Just operating under this constant systemic volatility every single day.
And to focus that lens even further for you listening, we need to look at the poorest of those nations, what the financial system categorizes as IDA-only countries.
Right, the International Development Association.
Yeah, meaning these countries are so impoverished they rely entirely on specialized grants and zero-interest loans. Within just those specific nations, there are 370 million people.
And this 370 million people are essentially trapped, right? Trapped in this brutal feedback loop where poverty and conflict just relentlessly feed each other.
Which brings us to the mission of our deep dive today. We are unpacking this massive, independent evaluation of the World Bank Group's assistance to low-income, fragile, and conflict-affected states, or what they call FCS.
Right, FCS.
Right.
And this report covers a huge chunk of time, from 2001 all the way to 2012.
So it serves as this brutally honest, unfiltered look at how the world's largest development bank actually attempts to repair economies in, honestly, the most unpredictable, dangerous environments on Earth.
And, whether you are listening to this to parse out international risk for a policy meeting, or you're tracking global finance, or you're just insanely curious about how massive institutions attempt to rebuild completely fractured states.
Which is a huge question.
Right. Understanding the mechanics outlined in this report is the ultimate shortcut.
Because we aren't just talking about the velocity of aid money here. We are talking about the actual mechanics of breaking a violent cycle and trying to rebuild the foundational concept of a sovereign state.
Exactly. And to understand the sheer complexity of that kind of intervention, we really have to start with the baseline data the evaluation provides, because the report establishes this incredibly stark comparison.
Okay, let's lay out the battlefield. What are we looking at?
So they analyzed 33 FCS countries. And within that group, 21 are classified as always FCS.
Meaning they never got off the list.
Right, exactly. They never managed to escape that fragile designation during the entire evaluation period. The remaining 12 are partial FCS, meaning they fluctuated on or off the list depending on the year.
Okay. And they compared them against who?
They benchmarked these 33 nations against 31 non-FCS countries. So nations that are equally poor, equally reliant on the International Development Association, but they are stable.
Ah, I see. So we essentially have a control group. Poor but stable versus poor and highly volatile.
Precisely. And when you look at the disparity between those two groups, the compounding effect of violence on just basic economic survival becomes glaringly obvious.
Let's hear the numbers.
Well, let's look at extreme poverty. The metric for people living on $1.25 a day. In the always FCS group, that sits at 57%.
Wow. Over half the country.
Yeah, but in the stable non-FCS group, it is 43%.
That is a massive gap just based on stability.
It is, and the macroeconomic divergence is even more pronounced when you look at growth. Economic growth in these fragile states averages a highly sluggish 1.8% annually.
Okay, 1.8%. And the stable ones?
In the stable non-fragile states, growth averages 3.3%.
So almost double the economic growth just by avoiding conflict.
Exactly, but, and this is the critical context here, you have to look at the demographics. Population growth is booming in the fragile states. They're hitting a 2.4% annual population growth rate.
Wait.
Compared to 1.9% in the stable ones.
Okay, let me just run that math real quick.
Yeah.
Because the economic reality of that is grim.
It really is.
If your population's growing at 2.4%, but your economy is only growing at 1.8%, then your GDP per capita is actually shrinking.
Bingo. The country is literally getting poorer on an individual level every single year.
So the poverty gap is mathematically deepening while they're stuck in this classification.
Exactly. It's this demographic and economic vice grip.
Yeah.
However, the data reveals this massive resource paradox that really complicates the standard narrative of poverty that we usually hear.
Okay, how so?
Well, when you isolate per capita GDP among these fragile states, it's actually highest in the most resource-abundant countries. Yeah, we are looking at places like Angola and the Republic of Congo, places endowed with just immense oil and mineral wealth.
Okay, so the wealth definitely exists within the borders,
Mhm.
but I mean, clearly it isn't translating to stability if they're still on the fragile list.
Right, because natural resource extraction in these places often functions as what's called an enclave economy.
Like a bubble.
Exactly. A multinational corporation can just, pump oil from an offshore rig, or they can fence off a diamond mine, generate billions in export revenue, and then deposit the state's share directly into the central bank or a sovereign wealth fund.
Completely bypassing the broader domestic economy.
Yes, bypassing the people entirely. Extreme poverty and these vast regional inequalities persist in those countries because the wealth basically acts as a prize.
A prize to be captured by the political elites rather than like actual capital to be distributed to the population.
Exactly. It completely proves that natural wealth doesn't auto-cure fragility.
If anything, I imagine an influx of mismanaged resource rents can actually exacerbate the conflict, right? It just raises the financial stakes of whoever has political control.
Spot on. And that dynamic actually exposes a really severe flaw in how the World Bank traditionally determined which countries were fragile to begin with.
Okay, let's unpack this because this goes back to our restaurant health inspection analogy from the beginning, right?
Right. So for a long time, the bank's diagnostic criteria relied heavily on something called the CPIA score.
The Country Policy and Institutional Assessment.
Yes. For those listening who might be unfamiliar, this is basically a grading rubric. The bank uses it to evaluate a country's macroeconomic management, their structural policies, public sector management, things like that.
Right. And historically, the rule was that if a country's harmonized CPIA score dropped to 3.2 or lower, they were slapped with the fragile state label.
But what's fascinating here is that the evaluation explicitly calls this out as a massive flaw. Because the CPIA was originally engineered to measure aid effectiveness, it was designed to tell donors whether a country had the institutional plumbing, so to speak.
You mean like functioning central banks, manageable inflation, basic procurement laws?
Exactly. It was meant to see if they could absorb development funds without the money just magically disappearing. It was never, ever designed to act as a seismograph for civil war or systemic violence or political collapse.
And the health inspection analogy.
Exactly.
Because theoretically, a government could maintain a passing CPIA score by, I don't know, keeping inflation low and having a coherent tax code in the capital city,
Right.
while simultaneously facing a raging, violent insurgency in its outer provinces.
And that happened. By relying purely on a policy grading rubric, the bank created these massive blind spots. They were essentially ignoring direct indicators of violence and political instability.
Did they have any exceptions to this rule?
The only exception the system made was if there was an active UN or regional peacekeeping mission on the ground.
Okay, so if the blue helmets were literally deployed and walking the streets, the bank would concede, okay, yes, the country is an FCS.
Right. But barring that extremely obvious indicator, the reliance on the CPIA led to severe errors. Errors of both inclusion and exclusion.
So they were misdiagnosing the patients right out of the gate.
Pretty much. The evaluation strongly recommends overhauling this entire diagnostic phase to actually integrate indicators of political risk and conflict. Because if the initial diagnosis is fundamentally misaligned with the reality of the violence, your subsequent treatment plan is going to completely misfire.
And that structural misalignment brings us directly to the treatment plans themselves. How does the world's largest development bank actually strategize a recovery when the state is functionally fractured?
Well, based on the report, the bank's effectiveness operates on a really stark timeline. They are incredibly highly functioning in the immediate triage phase of a crisis.
So when things just blow up, they're good at stepping in.
Yeah, the bank's post-conflict emergency response is a finely tuned machine. In the immediate aftermath of a conflict, they partner with the UN to conduct these rapid needs assessments.
Oh, wow. Oh, really?
And they can mobilize financial and staff resources with just remarkable speed. They really excel at launching short-term stabilization programs.
Give me an example of one of those programs.
A prime example is DDR, which stands for Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration.
Right, because taking the weapons out of circulation has to be step one for any viable economic recovery.
Absolutely. You buy back the guns, you break up the militia structures.
And I assume you have to provide immediate short-term public works jobs, right? Like clearing rubble or rebuilding basic roads.
Yes, to ensure those ex-combatants have an immediate income stream rather than just picking up another gun and returning to violence.
Makes total sense. So the bank does this rapid response stabilization highly effectively.
They do. The real friction occurs when that emergency phase has to transition into the medium term.
The marathon phase.
Exactly. Under standard operating procedures, the bank guides a country's development using a country assistance strategy, or CAS.
Which is what, like a 5-year plan?
Yeah, it's this comprehensive, deeply researched, multi-year blueprint. But in a post-conflict scenario, the environment is usually way too chaotic to commit to a strict 5-year strategy.
Because the government might collapse again next month.
Right. So to adapt to that, bank policy allows the use of an interim strategy note, an ISN.
Okay, an ISN. So that's designed to be a bridge, right? Like a 24-month temporary framework just to keep essential funding flowing while the dust settles and a formal CAS can be developed.
That's what it's supposed to be. But the evaluation uncovered a staggering abuse of this interim mechanism.
Abuse how?
These 24-month bridges morphed into permanent holding patterns. Afghanistan, for example, operated on an interim strategy note for over 10 years.
10 years on a 24-month interim plan.
Yes. Sierra Leone operated on ISNs for 7 years.
Okay, that is just, I mean, the operational consequence of running a country's recovery on a decade of interim notes has to be profound.
It's crippling because ISNs do not require the rigorous results frameworks or the deep structural evaluations or even the intense board scrutiny that a full CAS demands.
So the programs just roll over year after year without a formal mechanism to assess whether the overarching strategy is actually dismantling the root causes of fragility.
Exactly.
It's the equivalent of living out of a suitcase in an Airbnb for a decade because you are just too risk-averse to sign a lease.
That is a perfect analogy. It provides ultimate flexibility, like the bank can pivot or pull back quickly if violence flares up, but it completely sacrifices the ability to do any deep, long-term structural work.
Because you can't plan a national power grid or overhaul an entire education system in 24-month increments.
You simply can't. And when the bank finally does implement a full country assistance strategy in these environments, the performance metrics drop significantly.
Really, even with the full plan in place.
Yeah. The evaluation analyzed CAS completion reports, basically the final audits of these strategies, and they found the outcome ratings in fragile states were substantially lower than in non-fragile states.
What's driving that underperformance?
The primary driver is a profound lack of realism and selectivity.
Wait, selectivity, meaning they're trying to do too much at once.
Exactly. Looking at the completion reports for places like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Cameroon, you see this tendency to just try and boil the ocean.
Oh, I see.
The bank would initiate these massive projects across a dozen sectors simultaneously. We're talking agriculture, transport, energy, health, finance, all at once.
And they just ignored the severe limitations of state capacity.
Entirely. Think about it. A post-conflict government might literally be operating out of damaged buildings without stable electricity, let alone having a cadre of highly trained bureaucrats ready to execute complex policy.
Right. Pushing them to manage a dozen sweeping national reforms at once is just a recipe for total administrative collapse.
It really is. And that lack of selectivity forces a very uncomfortable operational dilemma on the ground for the bank staff.
What kind of dilemma?
Well, imagine you are managing a $100 million transport portfolio for the bank. You have a mandate to build roads to facilitate economic recovery.
Okay.
But the local Ministry of Transport hasn't paid its staff in months, and the staff they do have lack basic technical training.
So they can't physically do the work.
Right. So to meet your deliverables, the institution inevitably faces a choice between building the state, which takes years, or bypassing it to get the road built now.
And I'm guessing they bypass it.
Almost always. This manifests in what the development community calls the parallel universe of civil service.
The parallel universe. Okay, walk me through the mechanics of this parallel universe.
So you need the road built, you bypass the ministry, and you fund a parallel structure, a project implementation unit, or PIU.
A PIU.
And to staff that PIU, donors routinely hire expensive external advisors. Or, even worse, they poach the most competent local civil servants from the actual government ministries
How to do that?
by offering salaries exponentially higher than what the state treasury can possibly afford to pay them.
Wow. The paradox there is just stunning.
It's a huge problem.
In the name of state building, the international community essentially creates a shadow government that actively drains the absolute best talent away from the actual real government.
Yes, the PIU successfully builds the road, and that satisfies the short-term donor metrics. Everyone claps. But when the grant cycle ends and the PIU is dissolved...
The local Ministry of Transport is completely hollowed out.
Exactly. Left weaker than it was before the intervention even started.
That is wild. Does the development community acknowledge this?
Oh, it is a heavily recognized crisis in development economics. In fact, there is heavy pushback from a coalition of fragile states themselves, known as the G7 plus
The
sale.
G7?
Yeah, they champion this framework called the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States. And a core pillar of this New Deal is a strict mandate for donors to align their assistance with country systems.
Meaning force the donors to use the local ministries.
Right. The argument is that utilizing local ministries, despite all the inefficiencies and all the delays, is literally the only mechanism for genuine long-term capacity building.
But the friction there has to be fiduciary duty, right?
Exactly. Donor institutions are accountable to their contributing taxpayers or their bondholders. Pumping hundreds of millions of dollars directly into a fragile ministry with incredibly weak auditing controls carries immense corruption risk.
Yeah, I mean, the money could just vanish. So how does the bank thread the needle between utilizing country systems and actually protecting the funds?
The evaluation points to a tool called Development Policy Lending, or DPLs, as being highly effective here.
DPLs. How big of a chunk of the funding is that?
DPLs account for roughly 15 to 25% of all IDA commitments to fragile states.
Okay, a decent chunk. How do they work?
Well, unlike investment lending, which funds a specific physical project like a dam or a road, a DPL provides direct, unearmarked budget support right to the government's treasury.
Would they just hand them cash?
Well, no. The release of these funds is strictly conditioned on the government achieving very specific policy and institutional reforms first.
Ah, okay, so it's essentially a cash for reform mechanism.
Precisely. The bank provides the vital liquidity the state desperately needs to pay its civil servants or its teachers. But the state must, say, pass anti-corruption legislation or audit the central bank or implement a transparent procurement system to actually unlock those tranches of cash.
That's clever. And does it work?
It does. The evaluation data shows that regular, predictable budget support through these DPLs correlates strongly with improved long-term governance ratings.
Because predictability allows a fragile finance ministry to actually sit down and plan a budget.
Exactly. But, the success of DPLs in building macroeconomic capacity really contrasts sharply with the bank's handling of natural resource management in these states.
Let's talk about that. Because we discussed the resource paradox earlier, right? How mismanaged extractive industries, oil, diamonds, copper, act as rocket fuel for civil wars.
Right. And the bank definitely recognized this threat. They deployed significant resources to address it, but their intervention was completely asymmetrical.
Asymmetrical in what way?
Well, they were highly effective at the regulatory level. The bank really excelled at helping fragile states rewrite their mining codes or draft new environmental standards. They helped establish the broad legal architecture for extractive industries.
Okay, so they set up the rules of the game. That sounds good.
It is good. But the evaluation reveals a critical failure on the commercial side of the equation.
The actual money.
Yes. Writing a pristine mining code is necessary, but the actual economic value for the state is determined in the bilateral negotiation of the contracts themselves.
Oh, man. I can see where this is going.
Right. The bank fundamentally failed to provide these fragile, newly formed governments with the deep technical and legal assistance required to value their resource deposits accurately.
Or to negotiate the actual concession contracts against these massive multinational mining conglomerates.
Exactly. The asymmetry of information in those negotiating rooms is just staggering.
I mean, picture it. You have a fragile state minister, perhaps weeks into the job, sitting across the table from a literal army of corporate lawyers and geologists representing a multi-billion-dollar mining firm.
It's not a fair fight, and the results show it. While the broader macro regulations were technically on the books, The specific contracts signed behind closed doors often featured incredibly heavy tax holidays or just deeply skewed royalty structures.
Wow. So by not intervening at the contract negotiation level, the bank basically allowed fragile states to leave untold billions of dollars in potential state revenue on the table.
Billions. And when top-down state building moves at such a glacial pace and those macro-level resource revenues fail to ever reach the population, development institutions naturally pivot
Pivot to what?
to bottom-up strategies. They attempt to bypass the broken state machinery entirely and deliver services directly to the citizens.
Okay, this brings us to the human element.
Yes, this is where we see heavy investments in human capital and community-driven development.
Looking at the human capital outcomes in the evaluation, there's this fascinating divergence between health and education portfolios.
No, it's a huge divergence. Health outcomes in these fragile states are broadly improving, but at the same time, the portfolio ratings for education projects have steadily declined.
Which is wild. Why would one succeed and the other fail so consistently?
Well, the mechanics behind this divergence offer a crucial lesson in state capacity. Health interventions in fragile environments were much more likely to utilize innovative, non-state implementation models.
Like what?
The bank heavily leveraged performance-based contracting.
Okay, how does that work?
Instead of relying on a paralyzed Ministry of Health to build clinics and pay doctors, the bank contracted private service providers and international NGOs directly. And the mechanics of performance-based contracting are ruthlessly efficient in a vacuum. You pay an NGO a specific unit cost for every single child fully vaccinated, or for every maternal clinic successfully staffed and operating.
So it bypasses the state bureaucracy completely, delivering immediate life-saving results directly to the population.
Exactly. But education fundamentally resists that model.
Why?
Because you cannot sustainably outsource a national education system to private contractors.
Ah, right. Building curriculums, training a nationwide cadre of teachers, maintaining school infrastructure over decades, ensuring accreditation, all of that requires a massive, sustained state bureaucracy.
Precisely. You can parachute in and deliver a vaccine in a day. You cannot teach an entire generation to read without a functioning state apparatus.
That tension right there between short-term delivery and long-term sustainability, that seems to be the defining characteristic of community-driven development programs, or CDDs.
It absolutely is. And the evaluation notes a massive expansion of CDDs in the bank's portfolio during this period.
How does a CDD actually work on the ground?
The architecture of a CDD is inherently democratic, and it's decentralized. The bank provides a block grant directly to a local community, like a village council or a district committee.
So skipping the capital city entirely.
Totally. And the community collectively identifies its most pressing need, whether that is, a local well, a feeder road to the market, or a small clinic. And they manage the funds to execute the project themselves.
Honestly, in the immediate aftermath of a conflict, CDDs sound like phenomenal instruments.
They really are. They
Yeah.
deliver highly visible public goods quickly. They inject cash directly into the local rural economy. And they actually rebuild social cohesion by forcing fractured communities to collaborate on shared infrastructure.
It restores a basic level of public confidence.
Exactly.
But
There's always a but.
the evaluation exposes a severe structural flaw.
Let me guess. It's an economic sugar rush.
That is exactly what it is. It provides an immediate, vital burst of energy and capital to a traumatized community. But there is absolutely no nutritional plan for the future.
Meaning they don't plan for what happens next year. Right. The bank consistently failed to link these local community committees to formal, long-term local government structures.
Furthermore, they failed to establish alternate financing mechanisms for operating expenses. Because a CDD grant covers the capital expenditure, right? Like the cost of pouring the concrete for the clinic.
Yes. But when the grant closes, who pays the nurse's ongoing salary? Who buys the spare parts when the water pump fails 3 years later?
And the evaluation found the answer is basically no one. The institutional sustainability of CDDs is virtually non-existent.
Sadly, yes. They remain these isolated projects that slowly decay once the initial donor funding evaporates.
And as we look at the populations reliant on these fragmented services, the evaluation forces us to confront this profound oversight in the bank's methodology, a really severe gender blind spot.
This is one of the most critical findings in the whole report. The bank operates with this standard policy called gender mainstreaming.
Right, which means ensuring that general projects include metrics for women, like tracking the percentage of girls enrolled in a rebuilt school or women utilizing a maternal health clinic.
Yes, and mainstreaming is an effective baseline if you are working in a stable, developing nation. But the evaluation sharply criticizes the bank for applying that generic mainstreaming template to post-conflict zones.
They completely fail to address the specific, acute horrors of a fragile environment.
Exactly. And the most glaring omission is the utter lack of targeted response to conflict-related gender-based violence, or GBV.
Which is horrifying.
Mm.
Because in modern asymmetrical warfare, sexual violence is frequently deployed as a systemic weapon of war,
Yeah.
right? To terrorize and fracture communities.
Yes, it is heavily weaponized. Yet the bank's standard operational strategies rarely incorporated specific frameworks to address this massive trauma. They didn't provide specialized medical and psychological care or integrate GBV response into their broader community development goals.
They just treated it like any other development project,
Pretty much. And this blind spot extended into the immediate security interventions as well.
like the DDR programs we talked about earlier, the
Whoa.
disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration.
Exactly. The evaluation found that DDR frameworks focused almost exclusively on male ex-combatants.
Why? Just because they were the ones visibly holding the guns.
Yes. The institutional logic was brutally pragmatic. The primary objective is to stop the shooting, which means buying off the men holding the rifles.
But that rigid, weapons-based qualification for DDR support completely ignored the reality of modern militias.
Entirely. It excluded female victims of violence. It excluded women who were abducted and forced into labor or, bushwife roles within armed groups.
And what about female combatants who just didn't fit the traditional profile?
Excluded. They were all left completely outside the economic reintegration net.
And what makes this even worse is that these women often became the sole breadwinners for their fractured families after the war.
Exactly. And the bank largely ignored the severe legal constraints on their economic empowerment.
What kind of constraints?
Statutory and customary laws that literally barred women from owning land, inheriting property, or even opening independent bank accounts in a post-conflict economy.
So they are expected to rebuild the economy, but they legally can't participate in it.
Exactly. It represents a fundamental failure to adapt the intervention to the actual context on the ground, which really forces us to look at the broader economic survival of the population.
Okay, let's look at that. The World Bank's landmark 2011 World Development Report posited a very central thesis. It stated that breaking the cycle of violence requires three interlocked elements.
Right. Security, justice, and jobs.
Now, we know the bank is constrained by its charter from heavily engaging in security and justice.
Yes, they aren't the UM.
Therefore, job creation should be the absolute center of gravity for their fragile state's strategy.
It absolutely should be. Yet, the evaluation reveals an astonishing gap here. The bank lacks a coherent strategic framework for inclusive growth and long-term job creation in FCS.
So wait, didn't you say they fund jobs through those public works and CDD programs?
They do, but the employment they generate is heavily skewed toward short-term labor, like the public works programs clearing rubble or the temporary construction jobs tied to those CDD block grants.
Ah, I see. They provide vital short-term wage labor, but they do not alter the structural employment landscape at all.
Not even a little bit. And the most critical failure in this regard is agriculture.
Agriculture. Why is that the critical failure?
Because in the fragile states evaluated, agriculture constitutes roughly 25% of the total GDP. And more importantly, it is the primary livelihood for 50 to 80% of the entire population.
Wow, so it is the absolute bedrock of the economy for the average citizen.
Yes. Despite that reality, agriculture receives deeply inadequate operational support and funding from the bank in these environments.
Why would they ignore the sector that employs 80% of the people?
Because the complexity of post-conflict agriculture makes it incredibly difficult to fund through standard mechanisms. I mean, the rural infrastructure is usually obliterated, the supply chains are non-existent.
I imagine land ownership is a huge issue.
Oh, it's massive. Land tenure systems are usually in total disarray after a conflict. Resolving customary versus statutory land rights after a massive population displacement is politically explosive.
Right. Who owns the farm after everyone fled the village 10 years ago?
Exactly. And without clear land tenure, agricultural markets cannot formalize, and smallholder farmers cannot access credit. Because the sector is so fraught with political and logistical risk, the bank often defaults to prioritizing, sweeping macroeconomic reforms or large-scale urban infrastructure.
Leaving the sector that employs 80% of the population chronically undercapitalized.
Exactly. And if the bank struggles to stimulate long-term public sector employment and agriculture, the burden of job creation inevitably falls to the private sector.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the World Bank Group includes the IFC, right? The International Finance Corporation, which provides investment capital.
Yes. And MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which provides political risk insurance.
So if you want to understand what prevents private capital from entering a stabilizing country, you have to look at the constraints on the ground. What's stopping them?
Well, the evaluation highlights a reality that often surprises analysts. The primary constraint cited by businesses operating in fragile states is not just onerous regulation or corruption or even physical security.
Really? Then what is the ultimate bottleneck?
It's basic infrastructure, specifically reliable access to power.
Power, as in electricity.
Yes. Think about it. If an entrepreneur wants to open a mid-sized agribusiness processing plant, but the national grid only supplies intermittent power for maybe 4 hours a day.
They were forced to rely on imported diesel generators.
Exactly. And the operational cost of running heavy machinery on diesel completely destroys their profit margins. They simply cannot compete with imported goods. The lack of baseload power suffocates domestic manufacturing before it can even begin.
But despite these overwhelming constraints, private capital isn't entirely absent from these places, right?
No, it's not. The evaluation points to one sector that experienced transformational success: telecommunications.
The rapid expansion of mobile telecom networks in post-conflict environments, particularly in places like Afghanistan, serves as a blueprint for how private sector arms can function in a war zone.
It really does. The telecom victory is fascinating because it fundamentally bypasses the constraints that kill other industries.
Right. You don't need a national paved road network or a stable central power grid to establish a mobile network.
Exactly. You just build independent cell towers with their own localized power sources.
But telecom companies still face an immense risk of expropriation or, literal war damage to their towers.
And that is where the synergy between the IFC and MIGA proved highly effective. The IFC provided the necessary risk capital to operators like Roshan in Afghanistan, while MIGA underwrote the political risk insurance.
Protecting the investors against the total loss of their assets due to conflict.
Exactly. It proved that with the right risk mitigation instruments, private capital can enter a highly fragile environment, generate a solid return, and create cascading economic benefits.
Like the rise of mobile banking, which connects fragmented, unbanked populations almost overnight.
Yes. But we have to admit, telecommunications is somewhat of a unicorn in this space.
Because it's a high-margin service that citizens will pay for even in extreme poverty, and it skips traditional infrastructure.
Right. If the IFC and MIGA want to replicate that success in more complex foundational sectors like agriculture or light manufacturing, the evaluation states bluntly that they cannot rely on their standard business models.
They require what the report terms a corporate mutation.
I love that phrase. Corporate mutation.
What does that actually mean in practice?
It involves fundamentally rewiring their institutional DNA. Historically, the IFC's model is built on identifying large, highly bankable projects with strong corporate sponsors in stable emerging markets.
Right, big, safe bets.
But in a fragile state, the economy is overwhelmingly informal. The required project sizes are drastically smaller. We are talking maybe $2 million instead of $50 million.
And if a local entrepreneur in a post-conflict capital needs $2 million to scale a logistics business, applying the IFC's standard, rigorous underwriting and appraisal process is probably fatal.
Oh, it is. The administrative cost and the time required to clear those massive hurdles suffocates the deal before it can even close.
So to operate effectively in an FCS environment, these private sector arms need entirely new risk tolerances.
They do. They need streamlined, localized procedures that just accept a much higher rate of project failure.
And furthermore, this has to require a massive shift in staff incentive structures, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the loan officers. If a loan officer's career advancement and their end-of-year bonuses are tied to capital volume and financial return,
there's zero incentive to spend hundreds of hours structuring a high-risk, low-yield $3 million deal in a fragile state.
Exactly. Not when they could just close a safe $100 million infrastructure deal in a stable middle-income country and get a massive bonus.
You always have to follow the incentives. It always comes down to the money.
Always.
Which brings us to the macro cash flow. To fund all of these massive shifts, from overhauling state civil service to incentivizing risk-taking in private capital, we have to look at how the international community is actually distributing official development assistance, or ODA, to these fragile states.
And the distribution of that global aid is highly uneven. It's heavily influenced by geopolitics rather than purely objective development metrics.
Meaning the money follows the headlines.
Exactly. The evaluation data shows that post-conflict darlings, countries like Afghanistan and Liberia during this period, places that held intense geostrategic importance or high media visibility, they received massive influxes of per capita ODA.
The donor community essentially flooded them with capital.
Yes. But when you look at the orphans of the international system, countries like Nepal or Sierra Leone, during the same evaluation period, the contrast is stark.
How so? Weren't they doing the work?
That's the irony. The data indicates that these orphan countries were actually demonstrating more consistent progress on institutional reforms and the Millennium Development Goals. They were executing the hard, unglamorous work of state building.
Yet they received significantly less per capita funding from the IDA and the broader donor community.
Which really highlights the uncomfortable reality that aid allocation is frequently dictated by geostrategic priorities rather than purely rewarding actual performance.
That is frustrating. However, regardless of the volume of aid a country receives, the mechanics of how that aid is coordinated on the ground are evolving, right?
Yes, they are. The evaluation heavily emphasizes the utility of multi-donor trust funds, or MDTFs.
Let's talk about MDTS. Because to understand why they are so critical, you have to picture the sheer operational chaos of a post-conflict capital.
Oh, it is pure chaos.
You have 20 different sovereign donor nations and multilateral agencies pouring in. One country wants to fund police training, another wants to build schools, a third is purely focused on the judiciary. Right. And every single one of these donors requires independent reporting, separate audits, and constant meetings with the exact same 3 overworked, under-resourced local government ministers.
It literally paralyzes the host government. They spend all their time managing donors instead of running the country.
Exactly. So an MDTF solves this fragmentation.
Yes. It pools the contributions from all those various bilateral donors into a single massive fund. And this fund is typically administered by the World Bank.
So the bank acts as the fiduciary gatekeeper.
Exactly. And it aligns the pooled capital behind a single coherent national recovery strategy, completely eliminating the redundancy of 20 different donor projects competing for the government's attention.
That sounds incredibly efficient. But as the evaluation notes, MDTFs are highly complex administrative instruments, right?
Very complex. If the bank manages the fund with overly rigid bureaucratic controls, it just becomes a massive bottleneck, slowing the disbursement of vital funds.
But conversely, if it sets unrealistic expectations about how fast a fragile government can absorb hundreds of millions of dollars without triggering massive inflation or corruption,
it can destabilize the exact economy it is trying to rebuild. It is a very, very delicate balancing act.
So synthesizing the entirety of this 2001 to 2012 evaluation reveals a very complex dual reality.
It really does. On one hand, the World Bank Group successfully recognized the sheer existential scale of the fragility problem.
Right. During the evaluation period, they vastly increased their financial commitments to these areas. They boosted their field staff presence in fragile states by a massive 68%.
And remarkably, they elevated the performance of their active project portfolios to be on par with non-FCS countries. That operational turnaround is a massive institutional achievement.
But the structural systemic flaws remain glaring. If they're going to truly break the cycle of poverty and violence for those 370 million people, the Band-Aids have to be discarded.
They absolutely do. They must abandon the reliance on decade-long interim strategy notes and commit to deep long-term planning.
They have to integrate real, hard conflict analysis into their baseline diagnostics so they're not operating blind to the violence around them.
Yes. They must figure out how to build authentic state capacity without utilizing shadow implementation units that drain the local talent pool.
And above all, they have to restructure their approach to the private sector and agriculture to create the permanent long-term jobs that actually ensure a population's survival.
Building on that synthesis, There is a recurring, underlying friction throughout every aspect of this deep dive that really warrants deeper consideration.
What's that?
We have consistently seen how top-down, centralized state building struggles against the realities of weak capacity and entrenched political economies.
Right, trying to build the ministries from the top down.
Exactly, but simultaneously we see bottom-up mechanisms like community-driven development thriving in their ability to deliver rapid, localized results, even though they lack long-term institutional sustainability under the current model.
It really forces a profound question about the ultimate objective of international development in the 21st century.
It does.
Because if the traditional, highly centralized Westphalian model of a state fails so consistently in these fractured, highly complex environments, perhaps the international community's insistence on rebuilding that specific architecture is the actual flaw.
It makes you wonder, what if the future of stability in these regions isn't a strong central government dominating from a distant capital city?
Right. What if the most resilient structure is actually a formalized, decentralized network of autonomous, highly localized community programs?
Programs digitally linked and sustained by mobile technology, distributed block grants, and localized accountability.
Are we continually failing because we were trying to force a 20th century state apparatus onto a 21st century conflict zone?
That is the big question.
If the diagnostic tools are broken and the standard treatments are failing, perhaps it is time to stop trying to force the patient to fit the machine and entirely reimagine the architecture of stability itself. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the mechanics of power, capital, and reconstruction operating in the background of global events. We will see you next time.